Let's talk about stakes as a criterion that any undergraduate writer working on an essay about literature should keep in mind. This lecture is a somewhat extended version of what is already included in my one-page handout on stakes, also copied at my webpage on stakes, where this video is embedded, and where you may be watching this. Feel free to follow along with those as I talk. If you've received feedback from professors saying things like, "So what?" or "Find the so what," or "Why? Who cares? Missing the point, too safe, take more risks," or anything related to the idea of stakes, then this is a criterion that likely requires your attention. Implicit in any essay assignment in the humanities is the instruction to figure out how to care. Your mind and soul have the ability to care substantially about, to find the so what in anything. And you are here in a humanities major, minor, or specialist to hone your ability to care. Each time you face a prompt or subject that leaves you feeling uninspired, consider it an exercise in caring. By struggling to think within and to temporarily absorb an unfamiliar set of priorities, you will become a more engaged reader. Think about what we've said at other pages, other criterion pages here. At the specificity page, we've said, your job as a humanities scholar is to communicate convincingly, rigorously, and clearly some previously unseen depth, complexity, meaning, or beauty in a cultural artifact. I'm going to read that one again. Your job as a humanities scholar is to communicate convincingly, rigorously, and clearly some previously unseen depth, complexity, meaning, or beauty in a cultural artifact. The rigor page says, a successful argumentative essay will genuinely convince its reader of something that the reader did not previously believe. See the rigor page, and that thing you're convincing the reader of is, again, to communicate convincingly, rigorously, and clearly some previously unseen depth, complexity, meaning, or beauty in a cultural artifact. And the innovation page has said, the primary goal of a university humanities essay is to show the instructor who's reading it something about a class text that they had not seen before, in a way that changes, however slightly, the way that they will see it and teach it in the future. That's what an essay is. You are here to hone your ability to care about doing that. If you don't know why anyone would bother doing that, bother writing an essay in the humanities, unless assigned to do so, stop. Stop right now. Pause this and think about it, or talk to an instructor now, until you understand why doing that matters. So if caring is something that you learn to do, and let me pause on that again, that's not a reprimand or anything, that's sort of something that needs to be sussed out during the course of your time here in the English major, minor, or specialist. So again, if you don't know why anyone would bother doing what you do in an essay, unless you were assigned to do so, if you still think of an essay as some hoop you have to jump through just because you're supposed to get the grade and get out, even if you don't feel that in any particular assignment, if you don't understand it at a fundamental sort of conceptual level, what the point of an essay can be, it's time now to really take the time to meet with an instructor, myself or any other instructor, to understand why it matters or why it can matter. Talk to us about it if this explanation isn't enough. So, if caring is something you can learn to do, and you can learn to do better, then what can you do to develop your ability to care? Here's the biggest one by far. Engaged reading. The overcommitted English student tends too often to get through readings, to skim readings cursorily, sacrificing engagement, enjoyment, and retention for a false sense of completion, and then to graduate with a dehumanized sense of what the humanities are. Only weak writing can grow out of disengaged reading. Getting engaged reading involves some personal habits that are associated with reading. When you're reading something that you've been assigned, even before any essay has been assigned, right? So if you're reading something you've been assigned, even before any essay has been given to you about how you're going to write about this thing, it is crucial for you to get the sleep, food, and calm you need while you read. If your body thinks it's being chased, if you've given yourself an adrenaline rush about the reading, I gotta get through this, I gotta do this by this time, it won't have time for art. It won't have time for appreciation, and you won't be in the right mindset to be able to read deeply. If need be, read assigned texts incompletely but deeply. In humanities study, it is almost always better for your grades and for your soul to read texts incompletely rather than skimming or rushing the whole thing. If you've been assigned more than one text or chapter at once, it's often better to choose to read just one of those in depth than to skim all of them, except in those classes rarer in the advanced humanities that involve systematic tests of broad knowledge. If you're being tested on it, that's different. But if you're there for discussion, just to pause on this, if you're there to discuss the texts, then the way you would cram a text, say, for a test, which I don't recommend doing either, doesn't make sense. Like if you're headed for a 300-level discussion course in which you're going to talk about the texts, then the completion of the reading for that day is less important than the deep understanding and appreciation of the reading for that day, right? So consider, when you're pressed for time, maybe leaving the reading incomplete over reading it too quickly, right? Let's see. Set aside time ahead of every class dedicated only to reading. I recommend that you set a timer. Start on time and stop on time. At least set a certain amount of time, regardless of completion, in which you dedicate only attention to reading. Also set aside space, well lit, and free of interruptions and distractions. I'd avoid, if you can, reading while commuting. Some students, obviously, will have more difficulty getting time and space for thoughtful reading, but all students are entitled to it. A room of one's own, one might say, is the heart of literary studies. So, if you don't have the ability right now, for whatever reason, to find time and space to set aside for your readings that you are assigned, then you're missing some part of the heart of literary studies to which you are entitled. Talk to your professor for advice on this. There may be options you've missed about what can be provided for you on campus and what you can use to get those things you so need in order to appreciate all the work we're assigning you. Manage your sound. I recommend either silence or, in my case, music without lyrics. Try using earplugs or earbuds if managing sound in your reading space is difficult for you. And finally, generate notation in some form. Light notes, highlighting, underlining, or other marks that emphasize certain words or passages in the text that are worth returning to for clarification, analysis, or critique. As you do so, generate at least 2 questions or comments per reading that you can verbalize aloud. Hope that makes sense. And again, I'm not making any assumptions about the environments in which you read. Quite to the contrary, I'm insisting that management of the environment in which you read is crucial. And so rather than taking the makeup of that environment as a given, talk to your prof, talk to me, talk to whoever the prof is about ways to make your reading environment better. Make it more possible for you to appreciate in an engaged way. And environment is not the only part of engaged reading. I'd say that personal habits, getting the sleep, food, and calm you need wherever you are, right? Finding the lack of adrenaline, the non-fight or flight reading, and paying attention to reading text maybe incompletely but deeply are the first 2 important steps to engaged reading. But speaking of that last one, generating comments or questions, here's the next big thing you can do to help yourself learn to care. Speak up. Class discussion is the best way to increase stakes. Yes, I recognize all of the reasons you may have to resist the idea of ever contributing to class discussion, but you have to ask yourself, why does this keep turning out to be a requirement in my English classes? It's because, to put it simply, in-person discussion, that is, to borrow wording from the OED, quote, the public ventilation of a question, a disquisition in which a subject is treated from different sides. That public ventilation is required for ideas about literature to breathe. Talking about ideas in person, actually really in person, he said, onto a video recording, shakes up those ideas in ways that naturally generate caring and naturally generate stakes. Language, like the people who speak it, is wired that way. If you currently feel that class discussion is inaccessible to you, or even that it is a burden on you at all, if it's a chore you have to get over with rather than something that you actively desire, then the answer is not to find ways to sidestep or replace class discussion. It is truly to figure out ways, not only through modifications and accommodations, but also through innovation and creative thinking, thinking outside the box, of what participation could look like or be to make discussion workable and enjoyable for you. Yes, you. So that you can, in one way or another, contribute your thoughts to a live, real-time conversation and witness that process of aeration that the discussion provides. Again, I am not here trying to minimize the considerable barriers to participation that many students feel. I am rather calling for those barriers to be surmounted through collaboration and creativity, and through calling on profs like me to cut some windows into those barriers. We cannot afford to lose as many voices from the discussion as we already do. It's for all of our good to figure out ways to make sure discussion is inclusive, and to make sure that that inclusion is active, is useful, and is used. So for my class, at least, if you feel unable to speak up, approach me. I've got a ton of hacks that I haven't mentioned here. But for classes in general, you'll find that it increases your stakes the more you participate in the ongoing class discussion. And it'll be harder to generate stakes the less you participate. So if participation is unavailable to you, the trick is you have to figure out a way to make it work for you, whatever that may be. And again, think outside the box. Some of you already know that in my classes, I invite students who are unable to pipe into discussion to give me electronic or handwritten notes at the beginning of class so that I can work your observations into discussion in a way that aerates it, in a way that encourages people to respond to it. This, students have found, is really one really useful way of aerating their ideas and increases their stakes. So if your professor offers an option like that, take it. And if your professor doesn't, offer that option to your professor, perhaps in office hours, to say, what if I did it like this, particularly in classes in which discussion is a requirement? But if you're wondering why discussion is sometimes a requirement, or so often a requirement in English classes, this is part of why. It raises stakes. All right. Another helpful tip for building stakes for learning to care is to set yourself up to nerd out. Chances are very high that you have found yourself at some point in hours of deep contemplation about the minute details in some cultural artifact. Perhaps it's anime, perhaps it's YA fiction, perhaps it's the Bible, perhaps it's sci-fi, perhaps it's actually, Alexander Pope or something. If you haven't found the opportunity in your reading to go into hours of deep contemplation about the minute details in some cultural artifact, go find an opportunity to do so now. When intelligent people care about a made cultural artifact, close reading actually comes naturally. We only standardize what close reading is in the 20th century, but we've been doing close reading for the entirety of the history of reading, from parody to Bible study to fandom to anime. Did I say anime? To drunken debates about whatever. English classes are not about necessarily, they're partially about starting the stakes, but they're also about honing the national tendency, honing your natural tendency to care, so that its benefits can be communicated beyond the confines of your mom's basement, your small group of friends, or your own head, right? In media that last beyond a particular afternoon or particular wild night. So what I'm talking about is those nights when you're hanging out with friends so to put it like, if you're watching Buffy reruns, for instance, and some of the conversations that come with your friends from Buffy reruns are like really genuinely thought-provoking, because what does it even mean to ask whether a vampire can have a soul? Doesn't that get us to talk about like what the concept of soul is in the Joss Whedon verse? And if we're talking about that, right, you get going like that about some topic. You want to take that natural tendency to care so much about the details of something beautiful and hone them so that you can communicate those thoughts beyond the confines of that individual and personal experience. So, to find those stakes when you read or write for English classes, I encourage you to experiment by recreating environments and situations that have otherwise led you into the depths of passionate emotional exegesis. If you find that when you're around a certain group of friends, you start to really care about and think about those details, try talking to that group of friends about the subject you're being assigned for class. And yes, I'm even including here, in terms of recreating the environment in which you read, the judicious and careful use of substances, if that is something that makes sense to you and is safe for you. Put more bluntly, if your Buffy watching sessions are involve getting drunk or getting high with friends, and if you have a healthy relationship with drinking and or smoking, whatever, maybe it's worth having a drink or having a smoke before you read something you've been assigned in class to see what happens there as an experiment. I should add, as one former student who is very knowledgeable about these things has insisted I add, that the key here that I'm mentioning is to partake in these environmental changes only to the degree that they awaken your senses, not that they deaden them. If you are so gone that you perceive and remember nothing outside yourself, it's a terrible way to read Moby Dick. But it might be worth doing so a little bit loosened up, if that's something that makes sense to you. In short, whatever the environments or situations are that have otherwise led you into the depths of passionate emotional exegesis, try recreating them when you're doing your class reading. And there's a simpler, more everyday way to find your caring in stakes. Simply use your feelings. Your personal emotional reaction cannot be where your inquiry ends. Literary scholarship is about making a logical argument legible outside yourself. So it's not just about what you feel, but what you feel is often where your inquiry starts. It's like the divining rod that gets you to the well. Any emotional reaction works. Does a text or subject frustrate you? Does it bore you? Does it alienate you? Why would anyone read, let alone assign, this text? That's a great place to start. Some of the best writing about literature is done by scholars initially trying to sort through negative reactions to that literature. And by the way, meanwhile, liking a text is not the same thing as caring about it. Devoted readers of a text often guard their interpretations of that text with anti-intellectual preciousness. How dare you say that about Buffy? I quite like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Nerd. Push yourself to challenge your own assumptions about a text you hold precious. Push yourself to challenge your own assumptions about a text you hold precious. It may be unpleasant, but it will result in a richer understanding of that text in the long run. Seek answers in the text, in the evidence in the text, that help you articulate your feelings about the text in detail. So pay attention to your initial feelings on the first read, and then figure out why the text made you feel that way. Find in secondary sources where your feelings may differ from received wisdom about the text. I didn't feel that way when I read it. Again, that's a way to see what you might argue, and use your argumentation to challenge and complexify both other people's impressions, and your own. The more you have to defend and analyze and suss out what feels what in this text, the more rich your experience will be, and the more thoughtful and challenging and complexified your reactions will then be. So when you're doing so, mainly and above all, don't fake it. I think I've said this in other contexts as well. Feigning interest will likely produce a mediocre essay, even if it gets an A. And frequent faking will do lasting damage to your ability to write and think. In short, you have to actually care when you care. If you're just simulating caring, you're not honing your ability to care, you're honing your ability to pretend to care. And be wary with that. As George Orwell would put it, your writing makes your thinking visible. So pay attention when you're working on your essay to what it is that you're caring about here. If your essay is low-key trying to do anything other than communicate convincingly, rigorously, and clearly some previously unseen depth, complexity, meaning, or beauty in a cultural artifact, again, the thing you're setting out to do is communicate convincingly, rigorously, and clearly some previously unseen depth, complexity, meaning, or beauty in a cultural artifact. If it's not trying only to do that, if it's low-key trying to do something else, it won't do anything very effectively. When you set out to write your essay, be honest with yourself. Check in, perhaps through a free write or a conversation with someone you trust, about why you're really doing whatever it is you're doing. Are you writing to convince or to impress? Are you writing to argue or to satisfy or please? Are you writing to explore or to cover over insecurity of not knowing? Are you writing to lay truth bare or to mask unpreparedness? These are questions that any essay writer at any level, right? We have inferiority complexes all the way up, believe me. And so these questions are questions you have to ask yourself again and again. Why am I doing this? The more aware you are, the better able you'll be to figure out why you care. Thanks.